Hi everyone, this is where I got up to in the last video. I started this new sketchbook and was sharing some ideas that can maybe help you get started with a sketchbook of your own. I know it's often that fear of the blank page that can stop us from using sketchbooks, so I hope I can show you here that you can be a lot more relaxed about it and start enjoying it more. So since last time, all I've done is stuck a few collage pieces in. I found some quotes and poems about winter, which should tie in nicely with our theme at the moment, and then printed them out, and instead of cutting them out, I carefully tore the edges instead around the bits that I wanted. I think a torn edge looks a lot nicer than a sharp cut edge. So, as I've said, the theme I'm using at the moment is January. So I've been looking around at what colours that I associate with winter, and this might be different for you, of course, and that's fine. But here's a selection I've come up with for me, and a lot of my inspiration has come from the colours that I see in winter skies, especially on snowy, frosty days. So I'm going to start with these colours here. These are all watercolours, by the way, at the moment. So we've got a cerulean blue, Payne's grey, cobalt violet, Naples yellow and permanent rose. So the first thing I'm going to do again is wet the surface like we did last time, still with this large flat-headed brush. That'll be ready then to drop some of those lovely wintry colours into it, wet in wet. Going to start with the cerulean blue. I've got no plan really here other than to just put some of those colours on the surface and let them bleed into each other. It's also helping me get rid of some of the whiteness of the blank page in the process. If some of the paint settles in the creases, just dab it out gently with a tissue, and then that way it's not going to dry as a hard line later. So continue to add in the other colours, allowing them to merge gently together. Try not to blend them too much with your brush, as this can actually mix the colours into each other a bit too much. We still want to be able to see them as individual colours with their own identity. And if we interfere too much with a brush, then we're going to lose that identity and just end up with one colour throughout. Remember, if you want to soften any hard edges, you can do this with a damp brush or by just adding a little bit more water. And then when you're happy with the base of colours you've created, just let it dry. Okay, so we're going to add a little bit of indigo acrylic ink now. I'm going to use the dropper to draw a sketchy horizon line across here now. It's fine if this goes across a couple of pages, just try to ignore any joins, it makes it flow better. Then we're going to attach a little bit of water to this to encourage the line to bleed. Now this paper will probably hold on to the ink quite firmly, so if it's not bleeding enough then just add a touch more ink. Be careful though, as wherever you've put the water the ink will bleed into it, and we just don't want it taking over the whole area too much. You can see there's a better bleed happening here now that we've got a bit more water above the line. Just be really gentle with the dropper, don't squeeze it too much. I'm just pulling out a little bit of this diluted ink just to suggest a few shadow lines into this pink area, just for an extra little bit of interest. Okay, so I'm going to use this black beryl pen now to add a few winter trees in, I think. It's a soluble pen, so it'll bleed when I add water to it, and this particular brand bleeds with some really nice lilac tones, sometimes even aqua ones too. If you're a bit worried about going straight in with the pen, you can always plan your trees in first with pencil, but just use a HB or a B so that your lines aren't too heavy. I find when you're drawing or painting trees, it's best to start from the base, sketching in the trunk first, then coming out to the finer branches. This will allow you to get a little bit lighter with your marks, making the smaller branches towards the top of the trees a bit less dominant. I'm going to add a little bit of water to this now, just to get these lines to soften a bit. I'm using a smaller round head brush and just lightly touching the lines. Just be careful of adding too much water, as it can make your lines disappear and then you'll just end up with a bit of a grey splodge instead. And the more pen you have on the surface, the darker the tone will be when you add the water. So as I say, just be a little bit careful with this. Adding in a little bit of cerulean blue watercolour here now, just along this horizon line, and then softening with a bit more water. Now I'm going to be adding in a foreground tree. Again, there's no plan here, I'm just making it up as I go along, but just go with the flow, and if you want to add anything else into it, that's fine. Just trust your instincts. If something doesn't work out, you can always paint over it. A little bit of white gesso or some white acrylic paint, and any mistakes will be gone. Remember, it's a sketchbook, it's not precious, so you can just relax and have some fun in it. When you've got a bit of a structure in, again, add a little bit of water to soften the edges and get the lines to bleed slightly. You can always add more branches as you go along, so perhaps don't put too many in to start with. It's much easier to add more than when you have to remove ones that you don't want. I'm going to add some Payne's Grey watercolour here now to increase the shadow at the base, and it's really nice how the watercolour interacts with the acrylic that we put here in the previous video. The acrylic acts like a bit of a resist, and then the watercolour finds its way into the creases and gives a really nice textured look. Also adding a little more cerulean blue watercolour just to keep those wintry colours peeping through. And a touch more Payne's Grey, I think. I've masked off a square now using some of this decorator's tape to isolate an area. And I'm going to have a play with some of this lovely blue-grey acrylic, popping it on with a palette knife and maybe looking for a little bit of texture. Wanting to make sure that the paint goes over the edge of the tape so I'm not left with any gaps when I remove it later. You can always use your finger to fill in any gaps if you're finding it's a bit difficult to do with the knife. Adding a bit of white acrylic now, just for a little bit of variation in the tone, and then using a large soft-headed brush to gently soften some of the marks. Just keep it dry while you do this. And then just continue to add paint or soften with the softening brush until you're happy with the blend that you've got there, and then let it dry. Just going to see what happens now when I add a little bit of watercolour over this acrylic base, see what sort of texture it might reveal. But as I've said before, I have no plan here, I'm just playing, seeing what works and what doesn't. This might end up as something in its own right, a little separate study perhaps, or it might just be an interesting background for something, who knows. While that square dries off a bit, I'm going to add a touch more white acrylic down here with a knife. One, it'll give a bit more of a textured surface to work on, but it'll also help disguise some of the edges of the collage pieces, helping them to integrate maybe a bit more into the page as a whole. I think this square needs a bit more white acrylic on too, building up the layers a bit more, giving me an opportunity to scratch back through again with the tip of the knife for a bit more texture, and then we'll let it dry again. Going to remove the tape now, see what I'm left with. Whenever you're removing tape like this, always do it slowly and bend it back on itself, pulling away from your painted area. This way you'll see if it starts to tear any of the surface. If you think it is likely to tear, then just use a hairdryer and the heat will soften the glue and it should come off okay. I'm quite happy with that as a background, I think now, we'll see. So I'm going to add a couple more winter trees to the page, but this time using a permanent pen. This one won't bleed, so it'll enable me to do some washes of paint over it if I wanted to. It wouldn't disturb the lines or the shape of them. Making this tree go over into the square a little bit, just so it connects it with the rest of the page. Remembering not to do too much too soon, you can always add more later if you think it needs it. And then connecting it with the ground with a few grasses poking out the snow. This top part looks a bit bare now, so I'm going to add some watercolour washes and see what I think. Put water on the surface first, so you're working wet in wet, and then adding in some cerulean blue, softening the edges with a damp brush if you need. Adding in a little Payne's Grey as well to deepen down the tone a bit. And we'll do a bit of splattering too. Giving a bit more weight to the base here with some more Payne's grey. It's a bit more concentrated now, and it's sitting really nicely on top of that acrylic that we put on earlier. This is all looking a bit too much like a picture at the moment, and it's in danger of being a bit too pretty for me. So I'm going to disrupt it a bit and get rid of some of the white up here by using some of the blue-grey acrylic. And then using this scraper to pull some of the paint down and just see what it gives me. So this is looking better now. The blue-grey is connecting with the square we did earlier, which is nice, but I just want to soften the edge a bit by adding a little bit more water and scraping down again. And I think by adding some more of that blue-grey down here as well, it'll help the eye move around the page a bit better. A bit of scraping again, which will add to the texture. Adding a little bit of cerulean blue watercolour up here as well, just to soften that edge. Making this area a bit stronger now with some of the permanent rose watercolour. Again, wet the surface first so we get a softness rather than any hard edges. And then more Payne's grey here, a bit more concentrated now to deepen down the shadows. It doesn't matter if you get a little bit of a bleed with the colour above, just dab out any bits you don't like with a tissue. And I think I'm just going to strengthen that a little bit more with a touch of indigo ink. I'm swapping now to some white acrylic ink, and while this area is still a bit wet, I'm going to add some touches of white in here. This should give me a few nice bleeds and perhaps suggests a bit of snow as well. You can also see now where that acrylic paint that we put on earlier creates a bit of a resist with the indigo, gives us another tone and some lovely texture to play with. While we're playing with the white ink, I'm going to put some up here to perhaps suggest some clouds. Wetting the surface first and then just trailing the dropper through it, letting the ink seep out gently. Don't be tempted to squeeze it too much or you'll have too much come out. If you want it to bleed a little more or soften any of the edges, then just add a touch of water to it, but just be gentle with the brush. I feel this bit needs some more blue-grey acrylic now, so again I'm putting it on with a knife so I'm not being too precious about it. And then let it dry again. I'm just going to reinstate some of these branches that I've lost a little bit, just to bring them into the foreground a bit more, going back to using the same soluble pen again. And remember, you can do whatever you like with your pages. You don't have to follow me step by step if you don't want to. I'm just giving you some ideas and hopefully showing you that your sketchbooks can just develop naturally with whatever you fancy doing at the time. Making the branches of this tree a bit stronger now too, with this time with the permanent pen. So I think in some of these blank spaces now, I'm going to add a bit of text. If you want to do this, it can be whatever you want. It can be a phrase, a quote, some lyrics from a song, whatever takes your fancy. I just think it complements the images on a page really well, especially in a sketchbook. Adding a bit of splatter again now with some watered down white acrylic. This is helping to connect what we did last time to what we've been doing today. Remember to use a hard bristled brush to do this and hold it fairly close to the surface so that you can get a good splatter of paint where you want it and it doesn't go everywhere. Just going to soften these edges a little bit with some white acrylic and the palette knife again. And also make some of these pink tones a bit stronger down here using some of the cobalt violet watercolour. Again, working wet in wet and softening any edges with a damp brush if I need to. I feel I want to make a bit more of this light on the horizon here with a touch more acrylic ink and a tiny bit of water to get the edges to bleed, and then adding a little bit of white acrylic with a knife underneath as reflection. It's always a good idea to reference which colours you've been using, especially as this is your sketchbook, so I'm adding a few swatches down here that I can refer back to in the future. I'm using a white acrylic pen now to add a little bit more text into this space, and as you can see I've added a slightly stronger yellow, I think it was a cad yellow in watercolour, to give a little bit more of a glow around the sun. So I think I'm more or less finished now. I'm going to add a little bit more of a cerulean blue as a wash in parts, just to bring the whole thing together. I've also made some notes in pencil in some of the blank areas, just to remind me what materials and techniques I've used. So I hope you've enjoyed that and picked up a few hints and tips along the way. Remember to just enjoy the process of creating in your sketchbooks, and I'll see you again next time.